The lodge was supposed to be peaceful, but when I found footprints leading to our door that weren't ours, I realized we weren't alone. I've always loved winter vacations. The fresh powder on the slopes, the crisp air that seems to sharpen my senses, and the thrill of speeding downhill on skis. So when my parents suggested a week-long family getaway to a remote ski lodge in the mountains, I jumped at the chance. The idea of cozy evenings by the fireplace and days spent on untouched trails was too good to pass up. The drive up was magical. Snow-dusted pine trees lined the winding roads, and every turn revealed another postcard-worthy view of the peaks above. Eventually, we arrived at a large wooden chalet at the end of a narrow road, perched on a small plateau overlooking the valley. Thick walls, big windows, and a wraparound porch greeted us. And I remember thinking how perfect this place looked. It was old-fashioned in the best way, like something plucked out of a classic Christmas movie. Inside, the lodge was well-furnished and warm. There was a huge fireplace in the common area, its mantel adorned with vintage winter gear. My dad whistled, impressed by the rustic charm, while my mom admired the high ceilings and the sturdy wooden beams. My younger sister Mia squealed at the sight of a stuffed polar bear near the reception desk. "So cool," she said, running over to examine it. There was only one staff member present when we arrived, an elderly caretaker named Gerald. He was friendly enough, though his voice carried a tremor, and his eyes seemed a bit distant. He explained that the lodge usually teemed with guests, but a recent avalanche risk had caused many to cancel. We would be the only family staying there for the week. That news made my mom a little uneasy. However, the place looked safe enough, and with the promise of empty ski slopes, we decided to settle in. Our rooms were on the second floor, overlooking the back of the property, which faced the mountains. The first couple of days went by quietly. We explored the nearby slopes, had long dinners in the spacious dining room, and played board games by the fire. It was relaxing, almost too relaxing. It felt as if time had slowed to a crawl. On the third night, however, I heard something. I couldn't quite make out what it was, maybe footsteps in the corridor around 2 in the morning. At first, I figured it was just Gerald making his rounds, so I tried to go back to sleep. But then I heard the squeak of a door hinge, our door's hinge. When I sat up, my heart thumped. The corridor was pitch black except for a faint glow from the moon through a window at the end of the hallway. I didn't see anyone, but the door to our room was slightly ajar. The next morning, I mentioned this to my family. Mia looked spooked, but my dad shrugged it off. "Probably just the caretaker checking something," he said. But Gerald denied having walked around that late. "I lock my door at midnight," he mumbled, his voice trembling again. "I don't usually walk around after that." That night, a fierce snowstorm descended upon the mountains. The wind howled against the walls, and the old windows rattled as if they might shatter. The storm lasted into the next day, stranding us inside. With the power flickering and the heater struggling to keep up, my mom started complaining of headaches. She curled up in the reading nook, wrapped in 2 blankets. Mia was also on edge, skittish at every creak. My dad busied himself trying to get the generator running with Gerald, leaving me in charge of the fireplace. Late in the afternoon, I went out to the porch to fetch more firewood. That's when I saw it, a set of footprints in the fresh snow leading straight to our door. They were small, almost childlike. But none of us had been outside since morning. Mia had stayed in all day, my mom was feeling sick, and Dad had only gone to the mechanical shed with Gerald, which was in the opposite direction. It made no sense. The footprints circled around to the side of the house, leading toward a window. I followed them, adrenaline pumping. When I reached the side window, I saw smudged handprints on the glass. 2 small prints, almost as though a child had pressed their hands there. My blood ran cold. I ran back inside, told my dad, and he exchanged a worried glance with Gerald. The caretaker insisted no one else was on the property. "There's no other guests," he said, "and the roads are blocked off by the storm." My dad decided we should check all the doors and windows to see if someone had forced their way in, but we found everything locked. That night we huddled together in the lobby. The storm had taken out most of the power, so the only light came from flickering candles and the fireplace. Every sound outside made us jump, the howling wind, the scraping branches. Gerald sat with us, gripping a flashlight like a lifeline. My mom dozed off in a chair, her face pale from her lingering headache, and Mia stayed as close to me as possible, whispering that she felt like someone was watching her. Around midnight, I heard a giggle. It was soft and distant, like a child's laughter. I whipped my head around, scanning the shadows dancing on the wooden walls. My dad and Gerald stood up, ready to investigate, but Mia tugged at my sleeve. "Don't go," she whispered. "Please, don't go." Against her pleas, Dad and Gerald left to check the corridors. 15 minutes passed, then 30, and they still didn't return. I could feel panic scratching at my mind. My mom had woken up, her eyes wild with worry. She insisted that Mia and I stay put by the fire, but eventually my mom's anxiety overcame her, and she went to search for Dad too. That left Mia and me alone. I tried to remain calm, but my heart was racing. The silence of the lodge felt crushing. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant moaning of the wind. Then Mia tapped my shoulder. Her face was white as the snow outside. "I saw something," she said, pointing toward the staircase. I turned my head slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, but there was nothing but darkness. Suddenly, the fireplace roared as though someone had tossed a log onto it. Sparks flew up the chimney, lighting the entire lobby in a bright flash. For just a moment, I saw a figure standing on the bottom step of the staircase. It was small, maybe the height of a 10-year-old. It wore a threadbare coat and had long, dark hair covering its face. I opened my mouth to scream, but in that second the figure vanished. The flames died back down, and the room dimmed again. My sister clung to me, sobbing silently. "There's no one else here," I told myself, even though I knew that wasn't true. Something was here, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. I grabbed the flashlight Gerald had left behind and mustered the courage to inch toward the corridor. My voice trembled as I called out, "Mom? Dad? Gerald?" No answer. Mia followed me closely, gripping the back of my coat. We wandered through the halls, checking each room. Most of the doors were locked. Finally, at the end of the hall, we came to the entrance of the kitchen, where a faint light flickered. Inside, the overhead bulb buzzed weakly. I found my dad and Gerald lying on the floor, unconscious. My mom knelt beside them, shaking their shoulders. Both men were breathing, but unresponsive. Panicked, I helped my mom prop them up against the wall. She looked as though she'd seen a ghost. "I heard footsteps," she whispered. "Then I blacked out." We tried to wake Dad and Gerald, splashing water on their faces. Slowly, they came to. Dad blinked blearily. "We saw a child," he murmured. Gerald followed it. Then everything went black. Gerald was shaking so hard he could barely speak. "It must be the old stories," he managed to say. "A little girl who got lost in the snow decades ago, rumored to haunt the lodge." A chill shot down my spine. We had no idea the lodge came with such grim lore. If Gerald knew, why hadn't he warned us? But I guess it wouldn't have mattered. We were already here, snowed in with a malevolent spirit that refused to let us rest. With the storm still raging outside, we decided to barricade ourselves in the common area. We dragged some chairs and tables over to block the entrances and locked every door we could. The night was a blur of whispered prayers, trembling flashlights, and the occasional brush of cold air that seemed to move like a presence through the room. By dawn, the storm had slowed. The first rays of sunlight offered a shred of hope. Gerald hurried to the radio in his office, trying to reach the outside world. My dad and I stepped onto the porch to see if we could clear a path. That's when I noticed the footprints again. Fresh ones, leading away from the lodge, disappearing into the snowdrifts. Small footprints, as though a child had trudged off into the distance. Despite the creeping sense of dread, we pushed forward to get help. We discovered that the main road was partially cleared by a passing snowplow. The lodge's phone lines were still down, but it looked like we could drive out if we moved enough snow. So we did exactly that. Collectively, we worked all morning to free the car. By noon, we managed to leave. Gerald stayed behind to keep watch over the property. He said it was his duty. I still don't know how he can stand it, knowing what lurks in the silence of that old lodge. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I could have sworn I saw a pale figure standing in an upstairs window. watching us depart. My hands trembled on the steering wheel the entire way down the mountain. The memory of those footprints, the giggles in the dark, and the figure by the staircase will haunt me for the rest of my days. I used to love the winter. Now, every gust of cold wind feels like a whisper from that lodge, reminding me that we were not alone. I couldn't just leave them out in the storm, but when they asked to come inside, I started to regret my decision. When the blizzard warning started scrolling across my phone screen, I honestly didn't pay much attention. Blizzards are common in our area, and I'd stocked up on essentials earlier in the season. My small house on the outskirts of town had withstood plenty of storms before. I figured I'd brew some coffee, curl up with a book, and watch the snowfall through the window. That evening, however, the weatherman's dire tone made me reconsider my casual attitude. High winds, extreme cold, and near zero visibility. They warned of potential power outages lasting several days. My neighbors were out frantically salting their driveways and preparing their generators. I double-checked my own backup supply of food and made sure my fireplace was ready to go. By nightfall, the storm had hit with full force. Heavy gusts of wind slammed against the sides of my house, and snow piled up on the windowsills. The temperature dropped so fast that I could feel the chill in the air, despite the heater working overtime. I decided to light a fire in the fireplace for extra warmth and an extra bit of comfort. Around 9 o'clock, as I was layering blankets on my couch, I heard a loud banging on my front door. Startled, I paused, listening carefully. It came again, 3 quick thuds, followed by a faint voice calling for help. My stomach dropped. Who would be out in this weather? Cautiously, I pulled the door open against the wind. Snow swirled into my face, and I had to squint to see the figure huddled on my porch. It was a young man, maybe in his mid-20s, shaking so violently he could barely stand. His jacket was caked in snow, and his cheeks were bright red from the cold. "Please," he croaked, his breath visible in the frigid air. "My car spun off the road. I can't walk any farther." I hesitated for only a moment. Of course, I had to let him in. No decent person would turn away a stranger in such a storm. I ushered him inside, helped him peel off his soaking jacket, and guided him to sit by the fireplace. After I fetched some towels and extra blankets, I brought him a mug of hot cocoa. Gradually, the trembling in his hands subsided. He introduced himself as Will. I told him my name and explained that the roads would be impassable until morning. He nodded gratefully. "Thank you," he kept saying. "Thank you. I could have died out there." For the next hour, we chatted as the storm howled outside. Will said he'd been driving to visit friends in a neighboring city when his car slipped on black ice and slid into a ditch. His phone was dead, so he'd started walking in search of any lights in the distance. "I saw your porch light," he said, "and it was like seeing salvation." I felt a wave of relief that I'd left the light on. Despite the awkwardness of having a total stranger as a houseguest, I was glad to have helped. As the night wore on, the wind's fury only seemed to grow. The weatherman had been right. This was a massive storm. The power flickered a few times before cutting out completely, leaving only the glow of the fireplace and the dim emergency lamp I'd switched on. At least the gas stove still worked, so I could heat some soup. I offered Will a bowl, which he accepted with a grateful smile. Everything seemed fine until I noticed Will's phone on the coffee table. Earlier, he'd mentioned it was dead. I saw the screen light up briefly, as if it had received a notification. Confused, I asked, "I thought your phone died." He blinked, then shrugged. "Guess it's not as dead as I thought. Maybe it's glitching. Don't worry, there's no signal out here anyway." I let it go, although something about the situation began to nag at me. Maybe I was just on edge from the storm. After we finished eating, Will insisted on helping clean up. When he stood, I noticed a large tear in the pocket of his pants, like it had been ripped open. I couldn't help but stare. It looked new and jagged, as if cut by a sharp object. I didn't ask about it, but I felt a growing unease. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, it was just a rip in his pants, and the phone could have flickered on for any reason. But it was the look in Will's eyes when he caught me staring, an intensity that made my stomach lurch. We settled back in the living room, each wrapped in blankets. Conversation died down, and the only sound was the wind blasting against the walls. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the dancing flames in the fireplace, but my mind kept wandering. Who was Will really? Would a visitor spontaneously show up during the worst storm of the season? Eventually, we decided to sleep in the living room for warmth. I tried to doze off, but every small noise jolted me awake, the rattling windows, the creaking wood. Sometime around 2 a.m., I felt someone standing near me. My eyes snapped open. Will was looming above me, his face lit by the faint glow of embers. "Sorry," he whispered when he saw I was awake. "I was just trying to find the bathroom." My heart pounded. "It's down the hallway, first door on the left," I said, forcing a smile to mask my alarm. He nodded, then walked away. I heard the bathroom door shut, but something was off. The bathroom was the first door on the right, not left. I'd just given him the correct instructions, but he'd walked into the guest bedroom instead. I got up, nerves on edge, and moved closer to the bathroom door. It was still ajar. Clearly no one was in there. So where did he go? I tiptoed down the hallway. The guest bedroom door was partially open, and inside I could see Will rummaging through the dresser drawers, my drawers, with quick, frantic movements. My heart hammered in my ears. Why would he be looking in there? I should have confronted him right then, but fear paralyzed me. Instead, I crept back to the living room, waiting. Eventually, he returned, moving quietly and slipping under his blanket. I pretended to be asleep. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he looking for valuables, weapons, proof of something? Morning couldn't come fast enough. By the first light of dawn, the snowfall had eased, and the wind had calmed to a gentler breeze. I checked outside and saw my car buried up to its doors. Will woke and insisted he help dig us out, but I told him I wanted to check the roads alone first, using my snowshoes. He didn't object, which unsettled me even more. He seemed almost disappointed. I trudged down the lane, every step sinking me calf-deep into the drifts. As I made my way to the main road, I noticed a set of tracks leading off toward the woods. They weren't mine. Could they belong to Will? The idea of him wandering around the property in the middle of the night made my skin crawl. But something else struck me as odd. The footprints came from the woods and ended at my porch. They didn't continue past the house where he claimed his car was stuck. If he'd really left his car in a ditch, shouldn't the tracks have led from the direction of the road? My gut twisted. I reached the main road and saw the plow truck had gone by at some point in the early morning. The pavement was partially clear, enough to drive if I could get my car unburied. There was no sign of any crashed car up or down the road, not even a skid mark. Panic flared in my chest. Will had lied. When I returned to the house, I forced a neutral expression. I told him the road was partially cleared and that we could attempt to drive out. He nodded, grabbed his jacket, and followed me to the front yard. We worked together to dig out my car, the silence between us heavy. Occasionally, he offered a reassuring smile, but it felt hollow. Finally, we managed to free the car enough to inch it forward onto the road. Will hopped into the passenger seat. I started the engine and carefully navigated through the icy patches. As soon as we reached town limits, I pulled into the first gas station we saw. "I need to refill and grab some supplies," I said. "Would you mind waiting here?" He shrugged. "Sure." But as I walked away from the car, I saw him shift uncomfortably. I knew I had to move fast. I went straight to the cashier and quietly asked if they had a phone I could use. My cell service was spotty, but I managed to get a single bar. When I tried to look back at the car, Will was gone. The passenger door was hanging open and a flurry of snow blew in. I sprinted outside, but he was nowhere in sight. I frantically scanned the parking lot and the adjacent streets. It was as though he vanished into thin air. Shaken, I drove straight to the local police station to report the strange encounter. An officer took my statement, explaining there'd been a series of burglaries in rural homes during severe storms. "Criminals wait until they can catch people isolated," the officer said. "You might have just had a brush with one of them." My blood ran cold. I remembered him rummaging through the dresser, the strange phone activity, and the footprints that led from the woods. I realized I'd let my guard down in the face of a winter emergency, almost paying a high price for my kindness. Later that night, safe at a friend's place, I couldn't sleep. The howling wind in the distance reminded me of Will's desperate knocks. I wondered what he would have done if he'd found what he was looking for, or if I hadn't woken up to catch him snooping. Part of me felt lucky, another part horrified. It's hard to trust your instincts when a stranger is freezing to death on your porch. Now, every time a winter storm blows in, I'm torn between the urge to help anyone in need and the dreadful fear that I might invite danger through my door. Because in those dark, cold nights, you never truly know who or what you're letting inside. We thought the ice was solid, but when I saw something moving underneath, I knew we had made a terrible mistake. Our hometown winters are usually the highlight of the year. Sledding on the local hills, building epic snowmen, and most importantly, ice skating on the frozen lake at the park. Ever since I was a kid, I've loved gliding across the ice, feeling like I was floating on a glassy mirror. My friends and I used to race each other from one end of the lake to the other, the cold air stinging our cheeks, laughter echoing off the nearby pine trees. This year, the freeze came late. The temperature didn't drop enough to form a thick layer of ice until halfway through January. By the time it finally did, I was itching to lace up my skates. My friends, Marco, Tasha, and Ben, felt the same way. The local news said the park ranger had tested the lake's thickness, declaring it safe for skating as long as folks stayed near the shore. But we'd been skating at that lake for years and felt like we knew it better than anyone. We decided to explore the entire surface, no matter what the ranger said. We met early on a Saturday morning, the sky a vibrant blue, and the sun glinting off the fresh snow. The lake was quieter than usual. Perhaps people were still wary about the newly formed ice. The ranger's orange cones marked off areas near the middle where the ice supposedly wasn't thick enough. Naturally, we thought we knew better. At first, everything was fine. We stayed near the shore, warming up with casual laps. The ice held strong, and we joked about how the ranger was probably being overly cautious. The four of us ventured farther out, weaving around the cones. Tasha did a twirl to show off her figure skating skills, while Marco and Ben decided to see who could get to the far end of the lake first. I paused for a moment, relishing the cool breeze on my face. That's when I noticed something unusual. Tiny bubbles under the ice, swirling around like disturbed water. I'd seen trapped air bubbles in ice before, but these seemed to move in an odd pattern, almost like they were following me. I shook off the creepy thought and glided forward, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. Marco and Ben reached the far side, cheering and waving at Tasha and me. Tasha giggled, took my hand, and the two of us skated to meet them. As we neared the middle of the lake, I felt a strange vibration beneath my blades, like the ice was humming. I glanced down. The bubbles were larger now, and instead of a random scattering, they formed a line right under my feet, almost matching my path. My stomach did a little flip, but I forced a laugh when Tasha asked if I was okay. Finally, we all gathered near the far side where the ice extended into a narrow cove. The morning sun was higher in the sky, and a few other skaters ventured onto the lake, but none came this far. We were alone in our own little corner of winter paradise. That's when I saw the shape, a dark shadow beneath the ice, elongated like a giant fish or a person swimming below. I froze in place. "Guys?" I whispered, pointing. They turned and looked, their expressions shifting from playful to puzzled. The shadow moved slowly, almost lazily, in a large circle around us. Tasha squinted. "Is that a log caught under there?" she asked, but we all knew that water was too shallow for a big log to float under the ice. Ben, always the daredevil, tapped his skate on the surface. "Probably just algae or some weird buildup," he said with a shrug, but he kept his eyes on it anyway. A few more moments passed, and the thing kept circling, occasionally darting closer so we could see it more clearly. There was an almost humanoid outline, though distorted by the ice. Then, in the blink of an eye, it vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. The four of us let out a collective breath we didn't realize we'd been holding. We tried to laugh it off, but none of us could quite shake the unsettling feeling. Marco suggested we head back toward the main area. We all agreed. There was something about the cove that felt wrong. Halfway back, the ice moaned beneath us, sending a crack echoing through the still air. We froze again. Usually, that sound is normal for shifting ice, but it felt too close for comfort this time. We moved slowly, carefully, spacing ourselves out to reduce the pressure. That's when Tasha gasped. pointing at the ice near my feet. The shadow was back, closer than ever, pressed up against the underside of the ice as though it were looking at me. "What is that?" Tasha shrieked, stumbling backward. The shape moved in a jerky motion, sliding beneath Marco and Ben next. They both skated away, eyes wide with fear. My heart pounded. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a large fish or my eyes were playing tricks. But then the ice cracked again, louder, a spiderweb of lines forming around the shape. My instincts screamed at me to move, and I pushed off hard, skating as fast as I could toward the shore. Suddenly Ben cried out. I twisted around just in time to see him fall to his knees. A small section of ice beneath him caved, plunging one of his legs into the frigid water. He screamed in pain and fear. Marco and Tasha rushed to help him, but the ice was splintering. It wouldn't hold them if they moved in too close. In a surge of adrenaline, I shot toward Ben from the side, staying on thicker ice. I managed to grab his arms, and Marco latched onto my jacket. Together we pulled Ben out of the hole. His leg was soaked, his teeth chattering, and his breathing ragged. "We need to get off the lake now," Marco shouted. None of us argued. We moved slowly, mindful of each step, guiding Ben as he limped. The moaning and cracking followed us, as though the lake itself was threatening to swallow us whole. I looked down once more and saw the shadow beneath the breaking ice. It was right underneath Ben, matching his pace. A twisted thought formed in my mind. It wanted him. The final stretch to the shore was chaos. Ice shards broke away behind us. That unearthly shape continued to swim just beneath the surface. When we were only a few feet from solid ground, Tasha's skate caught a crack, and she stumbled. I whipped around, grabbing her jacket before she fell backward onto the thin ice. For a split second, my eyes locked onto the figure below. It seemed to turn its face toward me, hollow eyes gazing up through the ice. We collapsed onto the snow-covered ground in a heap, scrambling away from the lake. Ben groaned in pain, clutching his freezing leg. Tasha broke into sobs, while Marco pressed a hand to his chest, trying to catch his breath. My own heart felt like it might burst out of my ribcage. Some other skaters had noticed our frantic escape and rushed over to help. They called for an ambulance, and we all tried to explain what had happened. Of course, when they peered out onto the lake, they saw nothing but white ice and a few cracks. No shadow, no moving bubbles. We probably sounded half mad, babbling about something swimming under the surface. But we knew what we'd seen. Ben was taken to the hospital for mild hypothermia. The rest of us went home, shaken and silent. Later that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure under the ice. Had it caused Ben's fall? Why did it seem so intent on following us? Over the next few days, the town closed the lake for safety inspections, citing the cracks and the near accident we'd experienced. They put up large signs warning people to stay off the ice until further notice. Meanwhile, rumors spread like wildfire. Some said we saw a ghost, the spirit of someone who'd drowned in the lake years ago. Others claimed it was just a large fish with a weird shape, and we spooked ourselves into believing it was something more sinister. But I can't shake the feeling that there's something far more ancient or malevolent lurking in that lake. The way it watched us through the ice. I still see it in my nightmares sometimes. The dark outline under my feet, following my every move. When the temperature drops each winter and the lake begins to freeze again, I refuse to step foot on it. Marco, Tasha, and Ben feel the same. We'd rather miss out on our favorite winter pastime than risk a repeat encounter. Sometimes I walk by the park and see kids playing on that lake, their laughter carrying through the cold air. I want to warn them, tell them to get off the ice. But what would I say? That there's a shadow beneath the surface that might drag them under. I know nobody would believe me. And maybe, just maybe, that lurking presence only awakens for those who dare to go too far. All I know is that I'm never going back out there. Some things are best left beneath the ice. The town looked magical under the snow, but when the streets emptied overnight, I started to wonder where everyone had gone. When I first heard about White Peak Village's winter festival, I pictured a quaint, postcard-perfect mountain town covered in snow. My friends had to bail on our planned ski trip, so I decided to go alone for a weekend getaway. The festival promised hot cocoa stands, artisan crafts, ice sculpting contests, Exactly the kind of cozy holiday cheer I needed. The drive up was breathtaking. Twisting roads led me higher and higher into the mountains, each turn revealing a new panorama of snowy fir trees and frozen streams. By the time I arrived, dusk was settling in, casting a soft pink light over the entire village. A big wooden sign read, "Welcome to White Peak, where winter lives forever." I laughed at the tagline, but it definitely had that eternal winter vibe. I checked into a small bed and breakfast called the Pinecone Inn. The owner, Greta, was a kindly older woman who greeted me with a steaming mug of cider. She told me the festivities would start early in the morning, and the main street would be alive with music and dancing. Exhausted from the drive, I went straight to my room and fell asleep almost instantly. The next morning, I woke to bright sunlight reflecting off the snow. As I stepped outside, my breath caught in my throat. White Peak was every bit as charming as advertised. Picket fences, snow-laden rooftops, and a row of shops decked out in twinkling lights. People strolled along with cheerful smiles, and a group of kids ran around laughing, throwing snowballs. It felt like I'd walked into a holiday movie set. I spent the day wandering from booth to booth, sampling sweet pastries and sipping on mulled wine. There was a band playing festive tunes in the center of the street, and couples danced while spectators clapped. I took photos, bought some handmade soaps and knitted scarves, and chatted with friendly townsfolk who welcomed me like an old friend. By evening, I was positively beaming from the warmth of the festivities. That night, I dined at a local restaurant that offered hearty winter stews. I shared a table with a jovial middle-aged couple who told me about the tradition of lighting lanterns at midnight. "We all gather at the town square," the husband said. "It's quite a sight." I couldn't wait to see it, but fatigue from the day's excitement caught up with me. After dinner, I trudged back to the inn and fell asleep, missing the lantern lighting. When I woke up the next day, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The streets, which had been bustling with festival goers less than 24 hours before, were deserted. No laughter, no music, no chatter. Just an eerie hush. My watch read 9 a.m., so it wasn't too early for people to be out and about. Yet as I peered out the window, I saw not a single soul. Concerned, I threw on my jacket and ventured outside. The snow crunched under my boots. The booths were still there, but abandoned. Tables were overturned and half-eaten pastries lay out in the open, frozen solid. Lights that had once twinkled now hung dark and dead. A few lanterns lay scattered on the ground, their wicks singed. It looked as though everyone had left in a hurry, dropping everything. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice echoed through the empty street. An unsettling feeling coiled in my gut. I ran to the Pinecone Inn, hoping to find Greta. The front door was unlocked, the lobby empty. A teapot sat on the reception desk, still lukewarm. Greta's reading glasses were next to it, as if she'd just set them down. Upstairs, the rooms were vacant, some with doors wide open. Sheets were pulled back on the beds, and luggage was missing. It was like the whole inn had been evacuated while I slept. I stood in the hallway, heart pounding. How could an entire town vanish overnight? I tried my cell phone, no signal. I checked the landline phones, dead. I decided to head for my car and drive to the next town for help. That's when I noticed footprints in the snow outside the inn, leading away toward the forest. They weren't from a single person. It looked like multiple sets of footprints, all heading in the same direction. But why would the townsfolk march into the woods in the middle of the night? My curiosity got the better of me. Instead of leaving, I followed the footprints. They wound between the tall pines, leading me deeper and deeper into the forest. The silence was overwhelming. No birds, no rustling branches, just the crunch of my boots. At one point, I thought I heard faint singing, carried on a breeze. I quickened my pace, hoping to catch whoever was there. Then, I found something peculiar. A wide clearing in the woods where the footprints stopped abruptly. There was no sign of people, no sign of a campsite or gathering, just a circle of flattened snow, as if dozens of people had stood there. My heart pounded with confusion and fear. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. I scanned the perimeter, calling out for anyone who might answer. The only response was my own echo. Feeling a chill unrelated to the cold, I decided I'd had enough. I returned to my car, determined to drive to the nearest town with a police station. But as I reached the edge of White Peak, I saw something that nearly made me drop my keys. The big wooden sign that read, "Welcome to White Peak, where winter lives forever," was gone. In its place stood an old battered sign with peeling paint, unreadable lettering. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I jumped in my car and sped down the winding road. The snowfall grew heavier, and soon I could barely see beyond a few feet. My car's heater strained against the sudden plunge in temperature. I glanced at the clock. It was noon, but the sky looked ominously dark. After what felt like an hour of nerve-wracking driving, I saw a gas station on the side of the road, a flickering neon sign advertising hot coffee. I pulled in, relieved to see other people. The gas station attendant, a middle-aged man in a thick flannel jacket, stared wide-eyed as I stumbled in, breathless. I recounted everything, the festival, the vanished townsfolk, the footprints leading into the woods. His face went pale. "That can't be," he stammered. White Peak Village was abandoned decades ago. There was an avalanche, wiped out half the town. Survivors relocated. There hasn't been a festival there in 30 years. I felt my knees weaken. "No," I insisted. "I was just there. It was full of people, lights, music." He shook his head. "Ma'am, I grew up around here. White Peak is empty. Some folks say it's haunted, that if you go up there in the dead of winter, you'll see the town as it was before the avalanche. But it's just a ghost story." A cold dread settled in my stomach. I fumbled for my phone, scrolling through the pictures I'd taken. My heart nearly stopped when I saw that all my photos were gone, replaced with corrupted files and static. No evidence, no proof. The man looked at me with pity. "Maybe you got turned around in the storm," he offered. I staggered back to my car, my mind spinning. Could I have hallucinated the entire thing? The warm smiles, the festival music, the taste of mulled wine. It all felt too real. The next day I returned with the police, determined to show them White Peak. We drove up the mountain, but the road ended in a barricade. A trooper explained that beyond the barricade was an old avalanche site. "Dangerous to go there," he said. "What about the town?" I asked, my voice shaky. "You can see the rooftops from a distance, right?" But I saw nothing, just endless expanses of snow and rock. No sign of a village, no colorful booths, no bed and breakfast. The trooper said, "No one's lived up here for years." To this day, I can't explain what happened. The only thing I know for sure is that I went to bed in a lively, bustling White Peak and woke to find it deserted. Sometimes I wonder if the festival was a loop in time, replaying the final days of a doomed town, or if the spirits of the villagers continue their celebration year after year, beckoning outsiders to join them, only to vanish when morning comes. I haven't gone back. I'm not sure I'd even find the same place again if I tried. Every winter I see ads for White Peak Village Winter Festival pop up online, but when I try to click the links, they vanish or lead to dead pages. It's as if the town calls out only to certain souls. Part of me is tempted to return, to seek out that magical place and maybe find answers, but the memory of those empty streets still haunts me. Maybe White Peak is better left alone, a glimmer of holiday cheer forever frozen in the snow. The cabin felt like a perfect escape until I found the words, "Don't stay past midnight," scratched into the bed frame. I'm not typically the adventurous type, but after a stressful year at work, I decided that a winter getaway might be just what I needed. I found a listing for a secluded cabin rental on a home-sharing site. The photos showed a quaint, rustic log cabin nestled deep in the woods, with a roaring fireplace and a wraparound porch offering a panoramic view of the snowy countryside. My partner, Alex, and I booked it for a long weekend. The listing was hosted by someone named Cal, who had glowing reviews about their prompt communication and well-kept property. It sounded ideal. No nosy neighbors, no traffic noise, just a serene spot to recharge. We packed our warm clothes, groceries, and a stack of board games, looking forward to quality time together. The drive took us through winding roads that grew narrower as we progressed. Snow-coated pines towered above us, their branches creating a tunnel of white. When we finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the photos, a picture-perfect retreat. We found the key under the doormat as instructed and let ourselves in. Inside, it was even cozier than expected. A plush sofa faced a stone fireplace and a small kitchenette was stocked with basic utensils. The wood-paneled walls had a comforting glow, reflecting the warm light from antique lamps. "This is amazing," Alex said, setting down the bags. It certainly felt like the perfect escape. We spent the first evening enjoying a hearty dinner, playing a board game by the fire, and sipping hot cocoa spiked with a little whiskey. As night fell, the wind outside picked up, rattling the windows. It felt good to be safe and warm indoors, isolated from the rest of the world. We even joked about how this was the beginning of a classic horror movie setup, but neither of us actually felt uneasy. That changed when I went to the bedroom to get a spare blanket from the closet. The bed frame caught my eye. Someone had carved words into the wooden slats. Leaning in, I traced the letters with my finger. "Don't stay past midnight." It was faint, but unmistakable. My heart fluttered. Why would someone write that? I called Alex over and we examined it together. "Probably just some prank," Alex said, trying to sound casual. But I could see the concern in his eyes. We decided not to let it bother us. After all, the cabin had great reviews online. If something weird had happened here, wouldn't someone have mentioned it? We shrugged it off and headed to bed, but I kept waking up to strange noises, soft thumps and a faint scratching sound like branches scraping the sides of the cabin. Around 2 a.m., I could have sworn I heard a door creak open. I shook Alex awake, and we both listened. But there was only silence. He reassured me it was probably the wind, and eventually I drifted back to sleep, unsettled, but too tired to stay awake. The next morning we found footprints in the snow just outside the back door. They weren't ours. Alex tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a ranger or a neighbor checking if the cabin was occupied. But the prints led from the tree line straight to our door, then back again, as if someone had stood there, watching through the window. Unease spread between us. We tried calling Cal, the property owner, but got no answer. Text messages went unreplied. Our phone still worked, though the signal was weak. We decided to drive into the nearest town, about 30 minutes away, to pick up some extra supplies and see if we could reach Cal from there. The car's engine struggled against the cold, but we made it down the snowy road. In town, we ate lunch at a small diner. A friendly waitress asked us what brought us to the area. When we mentioned the cabin, she paused, glancing around as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. "Which cabin exactly?" she asked quietly. We described the location and how we'd rented it from someone named Cal. Her expression darkened. "You folks be careful," she said, leaning in. "Rumor has it that place was abandoned for a while after an incident. No one knows the details, but people say weird stuff happens up there." She wouldn't elaborate, and we didn't press. The ominous vibe was enough. Alex and I exchanged worried looks. On the drive back, we considered packing up and leaving early, but we'd already paid for the weekend, and we still had tonight and tomorrow left in our reservation. Plus, part of me refused to be scared off by what might just be local folklore. That evening, we locked all the doors and windows. Alex started a fire in the fireplace while I texted friends about our strange experiences. About an hour later, I heard a faint dripping sound coming from the kitchen. I followed it, expecting to find a leaky faucet, but the faucet was fine. Then I noticed water seeping from the ceiling, forming a small puddle on the floor. Great, I muttered. A roof leak. I grabbed a pot to catch the water and called out to Alex. He came over, shining his flashlight on the wooden ceiling. We both froze when we saw a damp reddish stain. It looked thicker than water. My stomach churned, and Alex's face went pale. He climbed on a chair, reaching up to touch it. The smell that hit us made us both gag. It was metallic, like rusty iron. It reminded me of blood. We frantically checked the loft area, but there was nothing there. Just an empty storage space, no source for that strange leak. We mopped up the puddle, unsettled and confused. Alex wanted to leave immediately, but night had already fallen, and we weren't too keen on driving those narrow roads in the dark. We decided we'd go first thing in the morning, no matter what. Sleep didn't come easy. We left the lights on, too afraid to be in total darkness. Around midnight, the entire cabin shook with a sudden gust of wind, Or at least that's what I thought it was at first. But the vibrations felt localized, like something had slammed against the outer wall. I grabbed my coat and a flashlight, determined to see what was happening. Alex followed close behind, though I could sense he was terrified. Outside, the cold was biting, and the night was quiet except for our own frantic breaths. We circled the cabin, shining the flashlight over the logs. Nothing looked disturbed until we got to the back corner. A single handprint stained the wood, a dark, wet handprint, about the size of an adult's. Next to it, carved into the log, were the same words I'd seen on the bed frame: "Don't stay past midnight." That was it. We raced back inside, grabbed our essentials, and decided to risk driving down in the dark. I felt as though unseen eyes were on us the whole time, watching from the edge of the tree line. My imagination ran wild. Was there someone lurking out there, or something else entirely? As we pulled away, I caught a glimpse of a figure in my rearview mirror. It stood on the porch, features obscured by shadows, hand raised as if waving goodbye, or beckoning us back. I slammed the accelerator, desperate to put distance between us and that cabin. We spent the night in a motel in town. In the morning, we tried calling Cal again, but still got no answer. We left a message explaining we'd left early due to strange occurrences. Later that afternoon, we got a text from the number. "I'm sorry. You should have heeded the warning." No other explanation followed, and subsequent calls went straight to voicemail. To this day, I have no idea what happened at that cabin or who, or what, left those warnings. The home sharing listing vanished shortly after. Alex and I still talk about it sometimes, the unnerving sense that we escaped just in time. The words "don't stay past midnight" still echo in my mind. I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we had stayed another night. Whatever secrets that cabin holds, we won't be the ones to uncover them. We've sworn off renting isolated cabins during the winter, and I refuse to ignore bizarre warnings scratched into the furniture ever again. They called it a harmless tradition, but when I saw what they were sacrificing in the snow, I knew I had to escape. I'd always been fascinated by small towns. There's a kind of insular charm and a sense of community you just don't find in big cities. So when my cousin invited me to visit his new home in a remote village up north, I jumped at the chance. He described the place as welcoming, with an annual winter festival that had been celebrated for generations. "You'll love it," he assured me. The town was even smaller than I'd imagined. Just a cluster of wooden houses along a single main road, surrounded by dense forests. Snow covered everything, reflecting the pale winter sun. My cousin, Martin, greeted me at the edge of town and led me to his place, a modest cabin nestled behind some tall spruces. He beamed with pride, explaining how the town had embraced him as one of their own. That evening, we joined the townsfolk in a communal hall for a feast, celebrating the start of the annual winter festival. Long tables were piled high with steaming dishes, and the hall buzzed with friendly chatter. An older man named Alden stood up at the head of the room, welcomed me with a kind smile, and spoke about traditions dating back 100 years. As the night wore on, I noticed something peculiar. Not one child was present. Every person in the room seemed to be an adult, mostly middle-aged or elderly. When I asked Martin about it, he shrugged. "They keep the kids inside during the festival prep," he said. "It's tradition. Don't worry about it." The next day, the real festivities began. The townsfolk invited me to join their winter rituals, carving symbols into blocks of ice, singing haunting melodies in a language I didn't recognize, and offering small tokens of food or wine at makeshift altars in the woods. I felt uneasy. The atmosphere was charged with an undercurrent of secrecy. My cousin insisted it was all harmless tradition, just a way to honor their ancestors. But that night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind carried strange sounds, like distant chanting. At times I thought I heard shrill cries. But the wind can play tricks, right? I tried to brush it off, telling myself these were just the odd customs of a quirky old town. On the third day, I woke early and decided to explore on my own, curious about the place. While wandering near the outskirts, I stumbled upon a clearing. The snow was stained red, and the metallic smell in the air made my stomach lurch. I inched closer, heart hammering, and discovered the frozen carcass of a small animal, its body arranged in a circle of footprints. It looked like a sacrifice. Horrified, I backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet. I immediately confronted Martin. He looked startled, but tried to calm me down. "It's nothing," he insisted. "Just an old ritual. They believe offering the blood of an animal ensures a bountiful spring. Don't freak out, it's part of their culture." But his eyes flickered with guilt, as though he knew it was more sinister than he let on. That evening was the festival's climactic event. The townsfolk gathered in the center of the village, forming a circle around a massive snow sculpture shaped like a horned creature. Torches flickered, casting looming shadows on the white ground. Alden led a procession, chanting in that strange language. I stood with Martin, watching in growing dread. Suddenly, a group of villagers brought forth a trembling goat, dragging it toward the snow sculpture. My throat tightened. I realized they were preparing another sacrifice. The chanting grew louder, and a hush fell over the crowd as Alden raised a knife. I couldn't watch. I turned my head away just as I heard the goat's agonized bleat. The crowd erupted in cheers, as if the brutal act were a grand triumph. I felt nauseous. Martin squeezed my arm. "Don't draw attention," he whispered. "This is important to them." I was horrified by his acceptance, wondering how he could be so complicit in such barbaric acts. After the sacrifice, Alden announced the final ritual would take place at sunrise on the outskirts of the forest. He invited everyone to attend, locking eyes with me as though daring me to refuse. I forced a nod, then hurried back to Martin's cabin, my heart pounding. That night, Martin tried to defend the town's actions. He claimed it was all symbolic, that no one was really harmed except for a few livestock. "They've done this for generations," he said. "It's their way of warding off frostbite and ensuring survival in these harsh winters." But something in his voice told me he was hiding more. I didn't sleep at all, filled with dread about what might happen at sunrise. Around 4 a.m., I decided to investigate. I crept out while Martin dozed, the moon lighting my path. In the distance, I saw flickering torches congregating near a bonfire in the woods. Trying to move silently, I followed the light. I arrived just in time to see a line of hooded figures leading a frightened young woman toward the fire. She was bound, eyes wide with terror. My stomach turned. This wasn't just about animals. They were about to sacrifice a person. In that moment, I realized I was witnessing the dark heart of this festival, something far beyond harmless tradition. I had to do something. I looked around for a way to create a distraction, anything to save her. My pulse thundered in my ears. The villagers formed a circle, chanting again in that guttural language. Alden stood at the center, holding the same knife from before. I grabbed a nearby branch and began banging it against a tree, shouting at the top of my lungs, hoping to lure some of them away. The chanting faltered, and a few villagers turned to see what was happening. I sprinted forward, adrenaline coursing through me, aiming to grab the woman. But before I could reach her, Martin stepped out of the shadows, blocking my path. "Don't," he hissed. "You don't understand." I shoved him aside, cursing his name. He tried to grab my arm, but I twisted free. A couple of villagers rushed at me. I swung the branch wildly, hitting one in the shoulder. The woman sobbed, struggling against the ropes that bound her. Alden raised the knife again. Just as he was about to plunge it down, I smashed the branch into his back. He staggered, dropping the knife into the snow. The hooded figures erupted in shouts. Chaos broke out. Some tried to restrain me. Others scrambled to grab the knife. In the confusion, I managed to cut through the ropes binding the woman's wrists with a sharp rock. "Run!" I screamed. We tore through the forest, the cold burning our lungs. Torches bobbed behind us as villagers gave chase, their voices echoing in rage. Branches slashed at our faces, and the snow made every step treacherous. But fear propelled us forward. By some miracle, we lost them, crouching behind a fallen log until the shouting faded. At dawn, we reached my car near the village entrance. Martin wasn't there, and I felt no guilt about leaving him behind. He'd chosen his side the moment he blocked my path. The woman, her name was Anna, was too shocked to speak much. She only muttered something about how her family had forced her to be part of the ceremony. We drove for hours, stopping only when we reached a larger town with a police station. We told our story, but the authorities were skeptical. They sent a small team to investigate, but they claimed the village was empty. No sign of a bonfire. No evidence of foul play. The few villagers they found acted clueless, insisting nothing illegal happened. They'd never heard of any sacrifices. Anna and I knew better. We parted ways after giving our statements, each of us too shaken to talk about it any further. To this day, I have nightmares about that hooded circle, the smell of blood, and the cold flames of those torches. Sometimes I think about Martin, whether he's still there, trapped in their twisted rituals. Or maybe he's become one of the zealots himself. All I know is I'll never set foot in a remote winter town again without questioning their traditions. Because beneath the innocent veneer of holiday celebrations and communal feasts, there might be a darkness so deep that it chills you to the bone, far colder than any winter wind. Which of these winter tales gave you the chills? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you love exploring the darker side of cold weather, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more frozen horrors from Twisted Thrills. Stay warm out there. You never know what's lurking just beyond the snowfall.